right, so what I would like to do is I'm going to walk you through what it is that makes a place a place. This is sort of a random collection of characteristics, if you will. Some of this stuff may seem really obvious. Some of it won't be obvious until I say it, and then it'll be really obvious. So how many of you have a sign in your yard that says keep it quaint? What does keep it quaint mean? And that's part of what I'm hopefully going to be able to take you through today. I think probably what you mean is we live here. There is a here. And so they keep it quaint means keep it being a place. So if we look at places, this is a tool that people use to, a naturalist would use to analyze a place. You have the beach, Atlantic Ocean, the beach, a dune ridge, a palmetto grove, an oak canopy forest, a mangrove swamp, intercoastal waterway. It's called the transect. Transect is basically just a tool to show how something is related to the things that might be near it or next to it. So as you progress from the ocean, you have to go through the beach to get to the dune ridge, to get to the palmetto grove, etc. Right? Okay. So when we analyze a town, we analyze it using a similar tool. This is the urban-rural transect. We go through from a natural zone through a rural zone, suburban, general urban, urban center, and urban core. And these are all of the different types of places that if you live on the earth somewhere, you live in one of these zones, you work in one of these zones, and you transfer through these zones when you're going to work or when you're going about your daily business. Go ahead. The T1, what we call the T1 is natural environments. These are areas with basically that are complete wilderness. There's no people out there. T2 are rural places. These are farmlands, wetlands, streams, large parks, working lands. Go ahead. T3 is suburban, and these are low density areas, typically very reliant on automobiles. Most of the suburban development is post-World War II. Go ahead. Large single family lots, large blocks, shopping centers, and some connected green spaces. Go ahead. So all of these different things, I just showed you 3 different images. You know, there's the Taco Mama on Highway 11. That's a suburban model of development. The previous house was what a lot of people are calling farmhouse, sort of. That's a method of urban development. If you back up 2 more. And then these we call snout houses. It's essentially a type of development that is single family houses on relatively small lots, but most of what you see there is designed for automobiles. That's really what suburban development, a lot of it is. Right. T4 is traditional neighborhood places. This is can be mixed use. These would be places where you would walk down to the corner store, say, typically single lots, typically apartments, generally curbs and sidewalks, high street connectivity. There's actually a block structure there, so if you want to walk around the block, you can walk around the block. T5 are downtown places, things like downtown Trussville, for example, the intersection of 11 and Chalkville. Higher density down there. Typically the traditional small downtown Main Street is sort of like the typical example of this. Downtown places can have civic spaces like town squares. Generally, they have a wide choice of housing types. It's not all just single family housing. Generally wide sidewalks with minimal setbacks, meaning the building is off the street some distance, but not too far off the street. And again, it's a tight street network. And then the urban core in this particular part of the world, Birmingham, downtown Birmingham is basically the urban core. And it makes sense for that to exist there. It's the economic engine for this area. And then all of the surrounding towns are that next level down, the T5 downtown, that support it or draw from it. Okay. And then the last one is something called assigned districts. These are things that just don't really work anywhere else, like heavy industry. Generally, those things are put out of the way and you don't have to worry about them. All right. So what makes a great place? Great places have sociability, uses and activities, comfort and image, access and linkages. This is sort of this little diagram with all these all these little characteristics like proximity, convenient, historic, attractive. This is like if you really want to go and get do a deep dive into how an engineer would solve this. This is the type of tools. So what I would like to do is go through and talk about some of the individual characteristics that are on this chart, but not really get into this chart so much. So what creates a sense of place? Sociability creates a sense of place. This is a great example of if you've been to Europe. This is a cafe on the street in Paris. It's a place. The walls of the street form a space. People inhabit that space. They sit on the sidewalk. They watch people go by. There's a ton of people. It's very diverse. There's a street life. And in evenings, things are active in the evenings. People are walking around and so forth. Street design is very important to creating a sense of place. Cahaba Project, for example, has this type of street section. So you have where the cars go, you have a green strip, typically with street trees. Some streets probably have more of that than others. The sidewalk is back off the street. The green space provides some protection for somebody being run over by a car that careens off the curb. And then the houses are stepped back from that. Narrow streets have a tendency to calm traffic. Sidewalks allow you to interact with each other. But it's all a public space, and it's a place to interact with each other. When you walk around the block at night, you pass the same people if you walk at the same time. You get to know those people sometimes. You can choose to get to know those people. On the other hand, US 280. It's a type of street design, but it's the exact opposite of that. Whereas the previous street design creates a place with the design of the street, this creates the anti-place. It's really a road. It just is designed to go from one point to another, and yet we tend to live so much of our lives, if we live in the suburbs, we spend so much of our lives traveling up and down this. The only interaction we have with people is when we're honking at them because they cut you off in traffic. One of the other things that creates a sense of place is the different types of uses and the activities. There's downtown Trussville. Local businesses, typically they're smaller shops, unlike further up Highway 11 in the suburban development, you have a lot of out of town companies. But you have local shops with retail sales, generally restaurants, and I think you currently in this area over here, you're working on an entertainment district that I believe is under construction. All of those things bring people into the downtown and give life to the city. All right, go ahead. This is further up Chalkville Mountain Road, for example. You can see the way that this building is set back from the street creates a park or a green space that enlivens that. It's a walkable place. It has retail. It'll have restaurants. It'll increase the property values of everything around it. These types of places have a tendency to have higher property values than the standard shops, and they really have they generate a lot more taxes for the city than places that are spread out. They doesn't take nearly as much infrastructure. If you're a local official and you're spending money to build shopping centers and you have to spend millions of dollars to extend utilities out, whereas if you do this type of development within the town, you're right there where all the utilities are. So from the town standpoint, it's a much better type of development. But the other thing that this does with walkability, my brother-in-law actually lives in Trussville. He had a brain injury and he can't drive anymore. It is incredibly difficult for him just to get food. He has to call Uber. He has to have somebody drive him somewhere. We have to come in from Birmingham, take him to the store and back. He actually moved out of Trussville to downtown Homewood because he could move into a loft there and walk to get all of his basic needs because he doesn't drive. So what creates a sense of place? Connectivity creates a sense of place. A block structure. This is a typical traditional block structure where you actually do have a series of blocks. This is the typical suburban model that's everywhere else. If the person that lives at this house wants to to get to school, they have to come all the way out here, enter the same transportation system that you would use to go to Texas to get to the school. Whereas within this block structure, you just walk. You know, you're right there. You stay within the smaller set of streets. You don't have to interact with the people that are out here going 80 miles an hour. Kids can walk. Same thing if this kid wants to meet that kid after school, because they both go to the same school, he has to go all the way around on his bike unless there happens to be an opening in the fence. Whereas in this scenario, which is what you guys have with the Cahaba project, it works nice. For example, and you can see there's a block structure here, right? There's several different ways to get out of here. If there's a wreck right here, you can get out there, you can get out here, you can come all the way around and get out there. Whereas in the suburban model, if you look at like that little development that's right off of, if there's a wreck right here, none of those people can get out. Take that problem and multiply it by the entire suburbs, and that's part of the reason the traffic out in the suburbs is so bad now, because there's no interconnectivity, there's no way around if something happens. All right, next. And this is a good example. You know, this is a large church that has a lot of parking. If that church were located near downtown, you have a large amount of land that was built specifically for automobiles, and that's all it does. Once a week, twice a week, it has people parking there. So what happens when we get self-driving cars? Sorry.
That's a question just about that. And maybe this is obvious to everyone. That model, the interconnectivity, the reason that doesn't happen in the suburban model is because it's really expensive.
And it's illegal.
Is incredibly expensive.
Well, and it's illegal to build the way using a block structure because of zoning, because of subdivision regulations. They prioritize the cul-de-sac model because an individual developer, all he has to think about is his piece of land. He builds a road in off the main street, puts a cul-de-sac at the end of it. He doesn't have to think. It's not hard. It doesn't require any public will. Whereas the interconnectivity model requires, like Trustful Springs, it required somebody to actually design a block structure and then figure out how it's going to tie back into 11. You know, the train tracks don't make it easy.
Sorry to interrupt that.
No, that's fine. But anyway, once self-driving cars come online in the next 10, 15 years, then we don't have to have this type of parking because, you know, if the church is meeting on Sunday morning, maybe there are restaurants all along the street that the church is up against, and they share parking. And you don't have to park right here to get inside because you can drop yourself off and then your car can go park itself wherever it can find a spot, right? So that's coming. It may be 10 or 15 years until it gets here, but that has a potential to drastically change the way we design cities and potentially eliminate a lot of the parking that we're putting in places where people would rather be walking. Living choices create a sense of place. Detached single-family housing, almost everybody in this part of the world lives in detached single-family housing. And then when developers build apartment complexes, they tend to build this, right? Because there's a lot of brain power involved in creating that development. And then all the rest of this stuff that used to be common to build, from duplexes to fourplexes to cottage courts, we just don't see it anymore. It's called the missing middle. So I would encourage you, when you think about future development in your city, these are the type of things that allow people that don't necessarily want to live in a house. You know, as people get older, they don't have kids anymore. Some people want smaller places to live. We get clients all the time wanting to downsize, and then they can't find anything. So we'll design them something, but then they end up doing this just because there isn't anywhere to do this. You know, personally, I'd love to live in an old school brownstone type townhouse, but where do you find those? It's illegal to build. All right, great. I'm getting off on a tangent here. What creates a sense of place? A comfortable place. It needs to be safe, walkable, typically historic, needs to be clean, and it needs to be human scale. So if you look at this street, for example, you have a relatively narrow street, just enough room to park and for a car to get by, but you have public space in the middle, and then there's another lane, travel lane on the outside, on the other side. These buildings are relatively close to the sidewalk. These buildings are relatively close to the sidewalk, they're relatively close together. It creates a place. That is a place. You can say, that's where you're gonna go take your photo, your engagement photo. You know, when your kids get married, that's where they're gonna go take their engagement photo. Except some people might do it here, but this isn't really the same type of place, is it? This is an incredibly wide street. It has all of this, you can see how much is given over to cars. All the garages are out front, all the driveways are out front. There's so many driveways you can't park on the street because you'd be blocking somebody's driveway. So what that creates is an incredibly wide street. Yeah, that's good. Creates an incredibly wide street that's designed for fire trucks to be able to get down it easily. Whereas this, the fire truck can still get down it, they just have to slow down a little bit to do it. But a lot of what drives suburban development actually is turning radius of the fire truck. But it's a completely different type of place, right? This isn't designed for people, this is designed for cars, whereas that's designed for people and cars just happen to use it. Okay. What creates a sense of place? Harmony. This is in Savannah, which we all certainly think of as a place. It's three houses that are very, very similar to each other, yet individuals, you know, over time they've evolved away from each other. Right, go ahead. You have the same thing here. You have a lot of houses that have a similar sort of characteristic to each other, right? Because they have similar characteristics to each other, they help create the definition of what is the Cahaba project. There are a lot of houses that use similar designs. That creates a cohesiveness, that creates a sense of what's appropriate for this place. History. Obviously, you know, the first high school was added, I think it was added to the mall later. It wasn't part of the original design, right? Or was it?
Gary, did you answer that question?
It's been there a long time, but I think I read that it was added.
It was original.
I know it was,
Okay.
it was kindergarten through 12th
Okay.
grade.
But it is a place where people who were in high school at that time think fondly back, you know, on that place. That creates you think of that place as your place because that's where you went to high school. So having it located on that mall, that increases the sense of place of what that mall is in the neighborhood in general. Okay. How do we preserve it? One of the things that we do is an historic preservation plan. I'm happen to be on design review for Highland Park, which is one of Birmingham's first ring suburbs. And we have that set of guidelines that we use when we evaluate projects that are going on in Birmingham or in Highland Park to make sure that we're objective, to make sure that it's not taste-based. It's not up to me to say, oh, I don't like the color of that. It's up to me to say that color is period appropriate if, you know, if we're doing something like that. Go ahead. And so here's a great example of a house. I stole this from your website. This is a house that has evolved. It originally had lap siding, now it has shingle siding. It lost its shutters at some point. The outbuilding is now gone and there's a room off to the side. It lost this porch, or the porch got enclosed, I'm not sure which. So the house has evolved. You know, these houses have the ability to evolve over time, but it takes somebody designing them that does it in a sympathetic way. You know, you have to design an addition or a modification in a manner that is appropriate in scale to the.
You mean you don't want Paul Kettle going out there and just tapping up 10?
Sometimes that works, but most of the time it doesn't work. All right. And the other way that you protect a place like this is with what's called a form-based code. A form-based code is a code that is attempting to get a certain result out of future development. Typically, it's an overlay code. So the regular building code or the regular zoning laws would still apply, but in this particular case, I think this is Lafayette, Louisiana, they decided they wanted sidewalks, you know, with awnings and galleries over them. And so the form-based code as an overlay offers that as a suggestion to a developer. So basically it's a marketing tool, it's a development tool that the city or whoever develops the code can give to a developer to say, if you're gonna develop in this area, use the form-based code and your development will automatically be the type of thing that we're trying to get you guys to do without having to tell you it has to all be, you know, a certain type of window or whatever. Because there's really no good way you can't create rules that will cause somebody to design something well, right? It actually has to be designed.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so are you familiar with the Pink House in Homewood?
Yes,
Um,
but not very. I'm aware of it.
okay, so like how would, or maybe you know, cause you chuckle.
I followed the thread on what's
Okay.
happening in Homewood.
I just wasn't sure kind of like if a form-based code like this is something that specific cities use, or if the cities are able to create their own code that they can then put on historic houses that prevents individuals that purchase the houses to make renovations to the houses in order to make the home livable for today's day and age family unit.
Generally, the form-based code isn't going to get it's generally trying to accomplish a certain thing in terms of how the buildings interact with the city. In Highland Park, we have a form-based code, and we're actually about to start design review on a series of townhomes where the form-based code allowed the townhomes, or caused the townhomes actually, to be pulled up to the street, so you didn't have this massive, front yard that frankly nobody that is in a townhome really needs, because they're up against a park anyway, and it's a lot more fun to run in a park than your little small plot of land. So the form-based code causes the development in that area to be appropriate for that type of area. Generally they're written for a specific area. So the one we have is written for Highland Park, it's Highland Park Overlay District. So if you were to gain one, it probably would not be written, it could be written for all of Trustful, but it also could be written for the Cahaba project, for example.
Question, this overlay, as you're describing it though, would typically be passed as resolution, not ordinance, correct? In other words, it is a strong suggestion. It depends, it could go either way, is that what you're saying?
I don't know, everywhere I've encountered it, it was part of the
It was
code.
ordinance, okay.
It was an overlay, it was another ordinance that overlaid over the
So
standard
it was,
zoning.
it was law.
Yes, you had to do it, you were obligated to do it.
May I address what the young lady asked about? I heard you comment about the renovation to make something usable to
Excuse me,
today's.
could you repeat her question, because we really don't know what she asked?
Would you repeat your
Yeah.
question, please? I
So-
think it had to do with if ordinances or overlays or restrictions could mandate what was done inside the house. Because you commented about usability and function now.
Yes, okay, so what I was asking was if you purchase a historic home and say you need to make renovations to said home to make it livable for a family in today's world, does the form-based code, oh my gosh.
Are you asking if it prevents it
Like
or
if-
dictates?
Like if the form-based code is above like a city ordinance that says, no, you can't expand that section of your house because this says you can't, versus,
It actually could.
I don't know if I'm like.
The form-based
making
code in
sense.
Highland Park, where I live, the form-based code will actually allow you to do some things that the regular zoning would not allow you to do, because that type of thing is a more urban, in that scenario, is a more urban way of building, right? So building a townhome that's up against the sidewalk, the zoning that's in place for my neighborhood was a suburban zoning that was overlaid just like projects. A suburban model, a post-World War II zoning model that was overlaid over the existing city. In some cases, they tried to fix it when they overlaid it and make it appropriate to what was already there. In a lot of cases, they didn't. Our current zoning does not allow guest cottages out back, for example. Yet there are half of the houses along my alley have guest cottages. It's illegal for us to build more of them. Why? Because they overlaid a post-World War II code on top of a pre-existing neighborhood. So the form-based code would have the opportunity to correct that if you wanted it corrected, or allow you to do other things that are appropriate to the particular location that the citywide general zoning ordinance would not. Does that make sense?
I think to simplify your answer, if you wanna renovate your bathroom in your 1920 Greek Revival house on Highland Avenue that you paid $1 million for on the corner, you may do so. However, most of design review will not allow you to then come and add a mid-century modern roof cap off on one side to make it look like Palm Springs. That's where this is going. So if you need to renovate inside your house, no problem.
But you just can't.
You can do that, but
But as far as like the exterior
as far as
structure-
going on the outside of your house and adding a spaceship like is down on Pensacola Beach and popping it on the side of your roof, thank God that really can't happen in Highland Park anymore, or Forest Park where I live, because Highland Park, as you know, in the 1970s, they started knocking crap down and building ugly apartments with mansard roofs all over the place. So, to answer your question simply, you can do anything you want to inside it.
Yeah, a great example would be, people are always wanting to replace windows, for example. In Highland Park, when they come to us wanting to replace windows, we don't care what's going on behind the window, but we need to make sure that that window is constructed the way a traditional window would have been constructed, so that the look of the house is historic in nature. That's the extent of it.
You wanna avoid the $2.99 vinyl window off the shelf.
Right, we don't allow vinyl because it falls apart. We don't allow the snap-on grids on the outside because they fall off. Or because we don't allow the grids between the glass because they look really, really thin, and nothing affects the look of a house more than taking the old window out, putting new windows in. So that's a hot topic button for us. Do we care if you take a wall out between the old butler's pantry and the kitchen to make the kitchen larger so now you have room for a big fridge? No, not part of it.
You can add on to a house to the side or back of it if you keep it in the general style that's desired.
Right, yes, and that's one of the things that and you can build new houses even, you know? We look at them to make sure that they're in scale with the neighborhood, they're in the character of the neighborhood, you know, they're appropriate to the neighborhood. That's really, and it's an objective. Back up one slide if you would. How many slides? That right there. This is an attempt to be a set of objective guidelines so that the people who are making the decision aren't using words like, I like that, or I don't like that. That's it. Whether I like it or don't like it's irrelevant. It's whether it's appropriate or not is the goal of this. Okay. We're off on a tangent. Human scale. Now, you look at this house, like we said, what is appropriate to the neighborhood? This is a really huge house. It's got 2 cars parked over here, 2 cars parked over there. This massive, you know, entry hall, that's the door, so a person's probably this tall, right? Whereas you come over to this house, a person is that tall. This is a much more comfortable house to live in. This is a much more comfortable house to live in than that. This is a house you think is more comfortable because you have more room, but we get clients all the time who want to add on to their house because they don't have rooms that they feel comfortable in. We go inside and you walk in the front door, there's a stair coming up, you go around the corner and there's a double high living room. It's too tall, they don't feel comfortable in that space because it's ill proportioned, and so we end up building another room out the back, you know, to give them comfortable spaces that they like.
Humans like small spaces.
Humans do like small spaces, and spaces should have a proportion of width, height, and length. Right? What else creates a sense of a place? There's a concept called affordance, which basically means how flexible is a space to do things other than what it was designed for. The mall is a great example. You know, I went to a fireworks show about half a dozen years ago. First Baptist gave out beach balls. We had a blast. The space was not designed to have a fireworks show and to get beach balls. It's a place that was designed to be flexible and allow you to do a bunch of other things in it. So let's go ahead. I'm taking up way too much time. Public space, that's a good example. What creates a sense of place? Having public spaces, public parks, the mall. Go ahead. And then additional resources. If you want to do a deep dive into any of this stuff, Congress for the New Urbanism is a group of people like me, most of them are much smarter than I am, but who design traditional neighborhoods, right? You can go to cnu.org. You can also go to the Incremental Development Alliance, if you're interested in that. The Incremental Development Alliance teaches people to be developers who want to do small scale development, not the type of stuff you're gonna see down, at the Target on Highway 11, but the person who buys a little sliver of land next to Chocolate Biscuit Tea Room and builds a little, 20 by 30 foot building, and then 5 years down the road, their business has grown, they add something else to it. Incrementally developing all of the places in between all of the other places, so that ultimately you end up with more of a city and less of a suburb. Right? Strongtown.org is another place to go. And then the last one is missingmiddlehousing.com. This is that missing middle diagram that I showed you if you really want to do a deep dive into all the types of places that people like to live that aren't single family houses. This book is a really good book, but Dan does a really good deep dive into that. So I talk way too long.
No, not at all, thank you, Chris.
But-
Any, questions?
Yes.
It appears that COVID has started running people out of New York City. Most of them seem to be going to Florida because they've discovered they can work at home rather than in the high rises. What, is that not gonna have an effect on, that's really gonna have an effect on, the whole United States as people move out of the metropolitan area.
I think it's gonna be a short-term bubble, actually. Yes, and I say that because millennials have a tendency to prefer social interaction. They really value social interaction a lot more than
You can do that
driving.
in high rise, you can do that in the suburbs.
You can, but you don't get nearly as much interaction on a day-to-day basis in the suburbs. I've lived in the suburbs, I've lived in the city, I've lived in very urban cities. I lived in Paris for a year, and now I live in Highland Park, which is a similar first, like pre-World War II suburb of downtown Birmingham. It was designed as a streetcar neighborhood until General Motors dismantled the streetcars. But it is a place where we walk around. We have sidewalks, we interact with our neighbors, we have block parties. It's a small enough scale that you can have a block party and have, 50 to 100 people or 100 people come to it. Whereas if you're in a suburban type of model of development, if you wanna have that type of party, everyone's gonna get in a car and drive to it because it's, 4 times as far to walk simply because the lots are so large. I'm not saying there's not a place for the suburbs. If I lived in the suburbs, I'd have a place to do my wood shop and all that kind of stuff too. But personally, I value where I live more so than living in other places. If you'll notice that chart I showed of the transects, there's still a place for the suburbs. I'm not saying that there isn't. It's just that needs to be part of a wider type of development that encompasses all the types of places that people want to live.
Here's my question. This presentation is great, appreciate it. I think that from my perspective, the Cahaba project has a sense of place, like its general theme, it has a sense of place. The thing that I see as a risk and an opportunity is one of the slides, I don't remember which one it was, but you were talking about harmony. And that to me seems like the biggest thing that is kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about the potential risk in the Cahaba project is that we lose a sense of harmony, right? That our community, I think about Edgewood, for example, has a sense of place, right? But it does not have harmony, right? There's no harmony in Edgewood. It's a beautiful neighborhood, but that's always my mental model when I think of Jefferson County in comparative to Trussville. I guess my question to you, in your experience, other communities that are in our place that have not previously, like I know there's examples of communities that have put protections in place, they put these overlays in place, but those were done 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
We're not there. So do you have examples of places that have done this more recently successfully?
Probably the biggest thing I would say is most of the examples that I can come up with were done just like when Birmingham tore down the train station. After the cat was out of the bag, you can't get it back in the bag. Everywhere you think of, everywhere that has these types of places, these types of historic district types of protections, they're always put in places after that straw that broke the camel's back, made it almost impossible to get back. You know, you gotta do it. You gotta do it while you have the opportunity. You can't do it after it's too late, because that's by definition too late, right? And currently living in a place that is an historic district, it's not a big problem. You know, it doesn't cause problems for us as homeowners. You just have to know the process to get things done. You know, and like when we do design review, we are required to have at least one architect on that panel. And when I was chair of that panel, I went and loaded it with a bunch more design professionals. And so we encourage people to come to us when they're considering doing something, so that we can help guide them in a direction that's appropriate, instead of them making a bunch of decisions on what they want to do and then coming before us and getting shot down. So we end up giving away a whole lot of free advice as a result, but it just makes the process simpler. Yes?
I think it's too late in Trussville to stop the mansions from monster houses. Yeah, I mean, they take down houses and just put up a 6,000 square foot house.
That is the difficult thing with that. Yeah, that's almost I hate to say it's too late, but there's some systems in place that cause that to keep happening. One of the biggest things Trussville could do, and I don't know that it would prevent the McMansions, but I think one of the biggest things Trussville could do is do a form-based code and subdivision regulations that require you to look at what future development might come later and develop the road system, you know, so that connection happens, right? Anticipate that somebody else is going to be building later, instead of having a bunch of cul-de-sac subdivisions stacked up one against another. Design them with through roads, you know, that don't go anywhere now, but will go when the next person comes in and builds. And it will create.
She's talking about specifically in the Cahaba project.
That's applicable to the city planning overall, but we
Yeah.
already have interconnectivity. I mean,
Right,
how the
right.
project's built on the grid,
Yeah.
which is standard in the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that you need to do, Cahaba project is fairly, well done. I mean, it was built prior to World War II.
Yeah, they're tearing down some houses to build a new.
Right, well, if you put the historic preservation guidelines in place, then whatever does get built new has to be appropriate in scale to the neighborhood, and you can't just tear something down because you want to. You have to have a good reason, or you have to prove that what you're going to put back at least meets the same sort of character of the neighborhood as what you're taking out. So it won't stop it necessarily. It can, I guess it's how it's written. In some cases, it won't stop it, but it certainly makes whatever goes back also appropriate to the neighborhood.
What was the catalyst in Highland Park that caused you guys to take them?
I think what he talked about is there was just so much stuff in the '70s.
Just random stuff.
So across from the Altamont retirement home, on that corner, there's a beautiful Victorian, and across the side street is the ugliest mansard roof El Cheapo apartment building. It's hideous. And what happened in Highland Park, well, let me backtrack. Initially, I-2059 was gonna travel along the edge of the mountain, and it was going to slice through Highland Park and through Forest Park. And the homeowners in Forest Park got together and said no and got it moved. This is a story I've been told, I don't know how factual this is. So at that point in time, this is when Highland Park going downhill, people are moving out, fleeing, owners are dumping property, and nobody cares what's built there. They're only interested in the tax base. And so that you can see, 1960, about 67-ish to about 73, 75. And there's that gap where there was there was malaise in Birmingham in general, and it shows up in Southside and it shows up in Highland Park. It doesn't show up in Redmont, it doesn't show up in Forest Park, but it does in those places.
probably because they're slightly closer to downtown and the real estate values were much less.
And they had become rundown.
Yeah.
The neighborhood had.
It was a protectionary reaction.
Yes, well, finally getting the design review was protectionary reaction, but prior to that, the building of the crap, everybody said, wait a minute, we can't keep building this crap. These ugly things that don't match. And so we now accept that that's what Highland Park is. It's a hodgepodge and a mishmash. South Side is much worse though. South Side is much more dilapidated and a lot more thrown in over there. Highland Park side of the area was nicer and larger homes, so it didn't take off quite as readily.
South side going over the tipping point may have helped save Highland Park, which was on its way over the tipping
Yeah.
point. And Forest Park was far enough out that it didn't get there.
I can only speak for myself, and I don't want to domineer the room, but, my perspective is that the challenge in the Cahaba project is much more subtle than what was faced in those communities. That was obvious, like everybody sees it. I think the challenge here is much more subtle in that McMansions, whatever we call it, the stuff that's being built back is beautiful, right? It may not be in scale, it may not be in, whatever architectural theme from 1938, but it's not ugly. It just doesn't fit. And so the problem, I think that we, and there may be people in this room that support protections, there may be people that don't, but from my perspective, that's the challenge, is that there has to be vision for what this can be, and it goes back to that idea of farming, that this could be a unique place nationwide. Because you come in here and you say, it's not just a place that we recognize, oh yeah, the Cahaba project, that's a nice neighborhood. It's like, that's historic, that thematically looks the same. Even if the houses are bigger, we add on to all that stuff. But it's a special place that represents a piece of US history that cannot be recreated. So that's the subtlety that I see, is that we could let this thing become, again, Edgewood. It could be a beautiful neighborhood, property values go up, everybody's happy. Or there's an opportunity to make it a unique place. And that to me that's my passion. That's my personal passion, is to say there's an opportunity to make this a special place. Not just because they're beautiful homes, small streets, walkability. That stuff's gonna be there, whether all these homes get torn down because of its location. Real estate is real estate is real estate, right? It's all location. What the city's doing is gonna draw people into that neighborhood regardless. That's the challenge I think that we have. Again, I'm just speaking for myself. That's what I observe.
I think you walked in a little bit after my intro. And this
Sorry,
is that, no,
I
that's
did.
quite all right, because
Totally did.
part of what we have found as the officers of the foundation in our research is not just talking about why we love the neighborhood we live in. It's really been researching the historical significance of it, which many of us knew, but didn't realize quite how unique this neighborhood is on a national scale. And that is something I addressed in the opening. It's so unique and significant that we are we stand behind it when we call this a heritage resource, a national heritage resource, because this neighborhood is not just representative of a particular historic era and time. It's a part of our American culture. It's a part of our American story. That, you put the culture and the history together and you have a heritage resource. And you have one that was built differently than the other 100 or so in the United States. You had 8 in Alabama, 8 out of 100 of these in Alabama. And I've learned that it was primarily because we had 2 members of the Bankhead family, influential, supportive of the New Deal, in Congress and the Senate, in the House and the Senate at the time, which goes to show why we might have had been favored with 8 out of 100 of these built here. And it's no really surprise when you look at the location of where this one was built, the proximity to Birmingham, like I talked about at the beginning. All these things made it unique, and then the slag in the land that made it not conducive to farming changed direction of the project and turned it, which we often refer to as the project, and turned it into this more of a garden community, suburban community, a type of community, as opposed to one that was principally farming like many were at the time. This one's unique. This was unique for more reasons than that we can get into later. But that's something that we've been looking at as a foundation, and talking to our elected city leaders about, to say this is not just a great place to live. This is something that's unique for A, B, C, D, E, F reasons, and because it's one of a kind in the nation, that makes Trussville one of a kind in the nation. That's significant. Yes.
My question is, we originally had all this stuff in the original zoning. It's back whenever they changed the zoning to permit everything that was all over you, Trussville, to be under the same zoning, are the ones that allowed all these unusually sized houses to be, actually tear down the old house and replace it with a much, much larger, bigger style.
Let's touch on that for a bit. Do you wanna say something else real quick?
It was just about the zoning. Is there anything we can do as citizens to ask
Sure.
that the zoning be revised?
Yes, and we're here and we're meeting and our foundation is, part of what our mission is supported by civic involvement. Is to get this discussion going. What I've learned about the zoning in the Cahaba project is that every property in the Cahaba project is zoned as R1, a state-sized lot, single-family house that is based on the size of the lot, it's based on the setbacks. It's a bit of a misnomer though, because duplexes also fall under R1, even though those that are still exist as duplexes and have not been converted to single-family homes, obviously are not a single-family home. The answer from the city clerk, just reading off of his understanding of what we have on paper, is that the Cahaba project was grandfathered into R1. I think what we've learned is a more accurate way of saying that is you could say the Cahaba project was the original R1. The Cahaba project lots did not change. The R1 definition changed to accommodate, as it evolved with builders' desires to build larger houses or same-size house on a smaller lot, right, to create a higher density. So we do have a zoning issue. It is that definition of R1 does not actually apply well to the Cahaba project, and it also does nothing to recognize the historic significance of the district. It doesn't set it apart in any other way from any other R1 property in the city.
Maybe it needs to be RH for historic.
There is an option, there is an ordinance, to Chris's point, there is an ordinance that's been on the books since 2000, section 30.0, RCP, CP for Cahaba project. An individual, you or I, could apply to have our property rezoned from R1 to RCP. How many individuals have done that since 2000? None. How many people know they have the option to do it?
One.
So, even, and this is not to criticize our elected officials, but there are even city council members that were not aware that RCP existed. There was not a public hearing specifically about RCP zoning options when it came about. There was an entire rewrite of planning and zoning in 2000, so you've got 250 pages. RCP section 30.0 is slipped in there. I'm not trying to say that it was hidden in there. It was a piece of a much larger, revision of planning and zoning. So there was not a public hearing. The reason it's not as widely known is because it wasn't singled out for a hearing. It was passed with all the rewrite at the time, back in 2000. So, and I've told the mayor that too. So when I hear people say, no one's chosen to do it, number one, I say it's because no one really knows about it. Number two, is rezoning an appropriate way to ensure protection of the character of a nationally historic district? Is it by opting, here you opt in, you opt in, you opt in, you opt in, you opt in? Is that any way for the city to recognize its one and only historic district, its own one and only, not just its one and only district, the one and only of its kind in our nation? Is that an appropriate approach? So,
I would think too that a resident would say to themselves, well, I'm not gonna opt in if my neighbor's not gonna opt in. Well, I'm not gonna restrict how my property can be constructed on, if they're not gonna adopt likewise restriction for their lot, like it's 4 or 5 lots down.
Good point.
You need an overall speed.
You're
And
signing
that's-
up for your property values to decline relative to the overall neighborhood, if you're the only one that has restrictions that nobody else does,
and what
or potentially.
Right.
And when you do have protections on the character overall, this is the most studied area of historic preservation. Property values. Property values appreciate at greater rates in historic districts. Why? It's pretty simple. You have investor confidence. Someone moving into that neighborhood that moves in there because they like it, know that in 20 years it's not gonna drastically change. They know it will change. And any type of historic preservation ordinance is not about limiting or restricting change, because that's unreasonable and that's unrealistic. It's about managing change. And that's the heart of what any kind of historic ordinance, whether it's through zoning overlay or through the state statute that enables a city to establish a historic preservation commission. There are ways to do this. The municipalities have every right to do this, especially when it's in the public interest or in the interest of people's property values. So there are options. I'm thrilled, Chris, that you mentioned just one of those options, brought it to our attention, specifically with the form-based code. That's something as a foundation we'll look into, because we are a resource not only for our neighbors, residents of Trustful, but for our city leaders. They've got a lot to do. This is maybe not on the highest priority. We as a foundation think it ought to be. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the reputation of the city of Trustful is on the line if nothing is done to project this character of the neighborhood, and it goes left subject to change, like anything is, like any city is subject to change over time. Again, it's about how are we, or do we have a vision for that change? Are we managing that change? Are we defining when an original Cahaba project house, a contributing resource to the district, can be demolished, and under what circumstances would that be permitted? And can it be incentivized to not demolish it and instead rehabilitate the home? Mm-hmm.
I have a question and a comment. The comment is, much prior to 2000, or whenever that, zoning incident occurred, whatever, there have been property in the project that have been, where homes were separated, and they had two big backyards butting up to each other, and people sold half their backyard and half their backyard and built another house that didn't match the project. There's several of those, a number of those, all through the project, where there were spaces that were then subdivided, rezoned, and people just threw up houses that didn't look like the project.
I'm personally not aware of the lots being subdivided, because that is something, any ordinance that exists there to protect property values. One of those ordinances restricts from dividing properties in the Cahaba project, subdividing them.
And
So,
there's one.
I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
Road between the mall and Oak Street right now, there's a piece of property for sale that's part of two people's backyards. It's just a little block of land, so I don't know how that happens. My question is there anybody in attendance from the city that's on any part of zoning and development board? Is anybody here?
We invited them here tonight, and I don't know if anyone was able to make it. We are recording the content of this meeting, and we're gonna share it with them, but I don't know if someone's spoken about it, but again, I'd like to hear more about what you're talking about, the subdivided lots, just for our knowledge. Just
There is one on Brentwood, Amy.
One on Brentwood?
Actually,
There's several on
the
Brentwood.
Davis's house, like, well, the one you live in now, not the one you grew up in, Bob, but, the, house that the people's live in now was built on a.
Yeah, Alex Sutter had that.
Right,
Yeah.
so this was a long time ago.
Right, back in the 50s, 40s.
I don't think it's possible to divide lots now, I hope that never happens again.
There are some for sale right now, but
It may have been divided a long time ago, though.
Right, I think that's
The
what
current
I'm hearing.
zoning does not allow subdivision of any, I know that, I'm not on the zoning board, but I do serve in a different capacity in the city. There is no ability to subdivide